Hey guys, today we're going to talk about His Dark Materials episode 7, The Fight to the Death. This was the episode where I actively screamed at my TV, finished the episode feeling extremely upset, and then spent some time digging around the internet trying to figure out exactly why this episode played out as it did. Like many of you, I'm sure, I was extremely disappointed and upset that the scene where Yorick and Yofer, the two armored bears, fight was so muted. It was stripped of all of its bloody, disgusting gore, and we barely saw any of it. The camera decided to focus on Lyra trying to drown out the fight while it was happening instead of the action itself, and for me that was a complete betrayal to the books. I will definitely be getting into that scene much more a little bit later on, but I do want to note that this episode did have a lot crammed into 1 hour. We also saw some major stuff go down with the Perrys. We saw Boreal's investigator and his associate Thomas break into the Perrys' home. We saw Will and Elaine figuring out that their home had been broken in and entered. And we see Will take that very big step in accidentally on purpose shoving Thomas off the balcony of the upstairs and hearing Thomas die essentially. And this is when Will becomes a murderer. Aside from that, we also see Lyra and Roger head with Yorick to Lord Asriel's lab in Svalbard, and we see the reunion we've been waiting for since episode 1 between Lyra and Lord Asriel, her father. In a very sharp contrast with the bear fight between Yorick and Yofer, the scene with Mrs. Coulter and Sister Clara was probably my favorite in the entire episode. We see Mrs. Coulter pretty devastated at just how much the project around her has literally burned down to the ground, and she decides the best way to vent those feelings is to choke Sister Clara violently and for a very scary amount of time until Sister Clara is almost dead. But not quite. This was the bright spot of the episode for me, even though I know that's probably very strange. Let's get into it. This episode started at Bolvangar, and the camera started focusing on Mrs. Coulter surveying the wreckage around her. She's obviously distraught and upset and sad that all of her hard work with this project has come to literally nothing, and the ashes are drifting about her in a kind of post-apocalyptic way. It doesn't take long for Mrs. Coulter to see Sister Clara outside, sniffling, looking lost and confused, and when Mrs. Coulter asks Sister Clara why she hasn't gone with the others to the airship to leave, Sister Clara says she's not really sure what to do because this is the best place she could possibly be. Mrs. Coulter has no patience for this kind of idiocy, I guess, and she says, "We cut away your demon, not your brain." So this is yet another indication that anyone who has gone through the intercision process is not really thinking clearly and has no sense of their own kind of judgment. Sister Clara says that she would really love to make Mrs. Coulter happy, and Mrs. Coulter considers it for a second and does what Mrs. Coulter does best. She gets on top of Sister Clara and starts choking her to death. It is such a bizarre, cold-blooded scene. This was really such an amazing study of a psychopath to me, how someone can take so much pleasure in taking away someone else's life. Honestly, this was so much scarier and so much more disturbing than anything that happened with the bears, which for me was purely physical. This was psychological. This is who Mrs. Coulter is to her core. She is a killer. She doesn't care about anyone but herself. It takes her quite a while Sister Clara is desperately trying to cling on to life, to realize what she's doing is completely inappropriate. And she snaps out of it and she says, "I didn't mean it, I didn't mean it." And it's almost like she's trying to take back what she just did. She stops just before she kills Sister Clara. Very strange scene. Definitely not in the books. For me, this was, again, the highlight of the episode. Lyra somehow survives her tumble out of Lee Scoresby's balloon, and we see Pan and Lyra in some very desolate looking area. Pan kind of wakes her up, and it's not long before Lyra is discovered by someone we will find out is a Svalbard bear. She is taken to Yofer's palace on Svalbard as a prisoner. I was so impressed and so excited by the visuals of the palace that we see. If we look really carefully, we can see some blood outside, indicating that some stuff happens here. I love the tusks outside of the palace. I love loved how harsh it looked. It was very close to what I had been imagining myself from the details we see in the book, and the inside was equally as cool. I thought the dungeons were very well manifested. And we also see that Lyra is not alone in the dungeon. There is another prisoner who happens to be a scholar. This is something that happens in the book as well. And though we didn't have the time to learn much about the scholar or how he is related to Lyra's past at Jordan, he does tell Lyra that beyond anything, Yofer really wants a demon. Lord Boreal is watching the same clips from the BBC News about John Perry and his Ice Core Challenge interview that we saw Will Perry watching in one of the last episodes. It's in this interview that he hears that John Perry is writing his family letters pretty much every day, and he gets the idea that there must be some kind of information in these letters that would be helpful. Lyra demands to be seen by Yofer Ragnarsson, and in the con of her life so far, she tells him that she is Yurik Bernisson's demon. She explains to him that Mrs. Coulter has been doing all kinds of experiments at Bolvangar, and not only are they cutting away kids' demons, but they're creating artificial demons for other creatures. Yofer asks a very clever question and says, "Why are you human if you're a demon? That doesn't make any sense." Right on her toes, Lyra says, "Humans have animal demons, so it would make sense that a bear would have a human demon." And I love this kind of logic. She says it so confidently that you're like, oh yes, that makes complete sense. And as part of her convincing him, she is tasked with a question. She consults the alethiometer and she finds the answer to Yofer's question, who is the first creature that he killed? And she decides the best way to present this answer to him is to flatter the hell out of him. She says, "You must be a god. I didn't know anyone was this strong. The first creature you killed was your own father." Yofer is very impressed by this and decides he wants a demon, and here one is, just ready and willing to be taken. Lyra explains to him that the only way she can become his demon is by having him defeat Yurik in single combat fight to the death scenario. When he kills Yurik, all of Yurik's power will flow into him, and Lyra will become his demon instead of Yurik's, rather than just disappearing like any dead demon would. Yofer seems very eager to do this, and Lyra manipulates the situation so that Yurik is not killed as soon as he arrives at the palace. Lord Boreal goes back to the Perry household, and through the front door, he asks Elaine if he can come in. She says she is absolutely not interested, but before she can lock the door, not sure why it wasn't locked to begin with, Lord Boreal opens the door and shimmies himself inside. This was a very scary and very smooth operation on his part, and it really reminded me of his snake demon. After he goes inside, Lord Boreal really makes himself at home, and we can see him trying every possible tactic to get Elaine Perry to open up about her husband and anything he may have left behind. We see Lord Boreal go through Elaine's mail, which is very weird. He invites her to sit on her own couch, which is even weirder, and he really makes himself as comfortable as possible so he can try to shake her down. He goes through the gamut of potential threats. He tells Elaine that he worked for intelligence. He tells Elaine when she questions his validity for being there that he can get any kind of paperwork, any kind of warrants that he may need. He tells her that she should not obstruct the Queen's government. And Elaine really pushes back against him. She says she has seen absolutely no evidence that Lord Boreal actually works for the government at all, and she is not about to give him anything. At his most frustrated, Lord Boreal's snake demon makes an appearance around his neck, and Elaine catches sight of it and is very frightened. And to me, this seemed to be the piece that really set her over the edge. This gives Lord Boreal an additional element of terror, and she does say, "I'm afraid of a lot of things, you're just one more thing that I'm scared of, but get the hell out." She is very shaken, but she does manage to get him to leave eventually. Lyra knows that Yurik must be very tired from running all this way to rescue her, and she's kind of put him in between a rock and a hard place with this. There's a very good chance he might not survive. When he does arrive, though, she manages to slip away from Yofer. She tells him what's going on, and she tells Yurik that she's managed to trick Yofer into believing that she is Yurik's demon. The fact that she was able to trick Yofer is very significant to Yurik, and he says if you've tricked him, this is like as good as done. We're cool. In the book, this is really where things diverge a bit, and we get to see the bears prepare for the fight. Yofer calls up all of his metalsmiths. He has beautiful gold armor created for him, shined into oblivion. He has the gold leaf filed off of his claws, and he has them sharpened. Whereas poor Yurik is tired, he's hungry, he probably hasn't rested in quite some time. And there's a sharp contrast between them. Yurik's armor is pretty sad looking, but he made it for himself, and there's strength in that. Whereas Yofer's armor is mostly decorative. We don't get to see any of that preparation or the preparation and ritual of preparing the fighting rink in the TV series, which I found disappointing because I thought they'd spent so much time and so much energy building this very believable bear world. It seemed not too far-fetched that they would go into that detail as well, but they didn't. Though they're in no way prepped and they don't go outside to fight, the fight between the bears starts pretty much immediately after Yurik arrives. Yofer summons Yurik to the throne hall, I guess, and we see them immediately start attacking each other. They've mysteriously both taken off their armor though, and I thought this was so strange. They're armored bears for a reason. They fight with their armor. It's a key piece of their identity, and I'm really not sure why the team behind the show decided that they should take that off. Luckily, the bears are pretty easily identifiable. Yofer has this strange mark on his head, on his forehead, that looks like it's probably drawn in blood, whereas Yurik has some very distinctive scars on his nose. So it wasn't a matter of identification between them. We see the bears fight in a very convincing way. I thought the movements of the special effects were really great, and we get the sense of just how big and bulky and massive and strong these guys are. Yurik takes a moment to push Yofer into a column, and he hurts him pretty badly that way, but Yofer does get the upper hand at one point, and he's doing a lot of dragging Yurik by his neck, and we see some blood collect here. But nothing terribly graphic. And then when it seems like Yurik is at his end and he's kind of lying on the floor pathetically, Lyra runs up to him and says, I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry. And she's really trying to comfort him in what she believes are probably his last moments. Yofer sees this and realizes that he has been conned by her, that she's not a demon and that she's never left Yurik's side. It's at this moment when they get very close to each other that Yurik springs at him, and we can't see what happens next. In the book, he's been pretending that his paw is damaged, and all that time he's been looking for a good foothold so that he can spring up against Yofer and take him down. It's that kind of trickery that he depends on, since he knows that Yofer is acting less like a bear and more like a human. And in the book, we see him rip off Yofer's jaw. The whole thing comes flying off, and there's just blood draining out of his face. It's definitely a very grisly and gruesome moment in the book, and as soon as that happens, Yofer pretty much dies, and Yurik eats his heart. It's definitely a bit intense. It's quite a scene, but it's one of the iconic scenes of The Golden Compass. And though the film adaptation in 2007 was horrible, they did at least include Yofer's jaw being ripped off and flying across the screen. I was so disappointed by this. I feel like, yes, it is challenging material. It's definitely violent material, but that's the point of Philip Pullman's books. He really challenges his readers to grow and to face difficult situations and to learn how to process things that aren't appropriate for children. It's what his book is all about. And I realize that we're not in a book, we're in a TV series that is heavily regulated by two governments in terms of what can be shown on TV to certain audiences, but I found this tremendously frustrating. I did a bit of research, and I have, I think, discovered that the BBC is rating this for age 12 and up, whereas HBO is rating this for 14 and up. I'm sure they're doing that to be able to bring in as many viewers as they can, but I almost wish that they had made this a more mature series, just so that they could really show what goes on. But I know I'm certainly not the only fan to be bitterly disappointed and angry about it. If you can show Mrs. Coulter choking out a nurse in the very first scene of the show, we can see some more blood between fake bears. Come on, guys. When this fight is reaching its crescendo in the TV series, the camera deliberately leaves the bears in the background and focuses sharply on Lyra's face as she tries to drown out the horrible bear-on-bear violence happening behind her. So we don't actually see anything major happening. We don't hear any big death grunts or gasps. And it's really left to the audience's imagination of what goes on and the order of events. Again, I understand that they're trying to market this towards a younger audience, but I am not okay with it and I will not forgive it, and I don't care that it's meant for 12-year-olds. I was 11 when I read this book, and I remember feeling the shock and disgust of seeing, in my mind's eye of course, Yurik eating a bear heart, but it made sense. This is not human behavior, this is not human culture, and bears are wild. They're not like us, and I thought that distinction for an 11-year-old brain was really important, that there are things that we can respect but not agree with. We got none of that here. We only find out who has won the fight between the bears when we see Lyra packing blood moss into Yurik's wounds. I was still a little bit full of rage at this point, but I did appreciate this scene. This is when Yurik tells Lyra just how much he appreciates her and just how much she's done to help him regain his kingdom and his position at Svalbard. He tells her that she has earned herself a new name. She will no longer be Lyra Belacqua. She will from now on be called Lyra Silvertongue. I think they have such a special relationship. I also like that Lyra has been welcomed into so many communities. We saw Ma Costa tell Lyra that she was definitely a part of the Egyptian community. We've seen Lyra herself say that she is practically Egyptian herself. In the book, we hear that Lyra has witch oil in her, and here Yurik is extending his paw to her as part of the Svalbard bear community. We move back to our world at this point, and we see Elaine leaving the Perry home to go to Will's school and tell him what's going on. Will does seem distinctly annoyed when he sees her rushing up to him, but it takes him just a few minutes to realize that she's genuinely upset as she tells him that she's been visited again by the same man who saw her before, and that this time he had a snake with him. She says that he's been asking all kinds of questions about John Perry and that he is trying to get as much information out of her as possible, but she is not willing to give him any. She also tells Will that they think that John Perry might be alive. After Yurik wins Svalbard as his own kingdom again, he tells the bears that this is the moment when they can choose to follow bear ways instead of human ways. And we see them take off all of their very ornate armor as a return to get back to what Svalbard has always been. In the book, this was a bit of a bigger moment because Svalbard had so many human elements. So many of the bears were wearing jewelry and sashes. Some of them had stuffed dolls to reference demons, and we found out in the book that Yofer's looked a bit like Mrs. Coulter's, which is hilarious and creepy. Yurik also takes Lyra to see Roger, where he stationed Roger safely out of the way, and they have a very sweet and happy reunion. Before this, they weren't really sure how the other person had fared, and Yurik asks Lyra to find out what has happened to Lee and whether Lee is safe. Lyra consults the alethiometer and realizes that Lee is safe. His balloon has crashed, but he's relatively unharmed. At this point, Lyra realizes that she has another task and that the alethiometer is really what has been driving her to Azrael. She needs to bring the alethiometer to him. She decides and asks Yurik if he can take her, and Roger says that he definitely wants to come too. Our attention turns back to Mrs. Coulter for the first time in a while, and we see her in this big warehouse, or maybe airfield. Father MacPhail appears, and Mrs. Coulter and Father MacPhail have yet another dramatic and juicy conversation. Father MacPhail seems to enjoy telling Mrs. Coulter just how much she's failed in her Bolvangar experiment, that her time with the magisterium is really coming to its end, and that the cardinal wants to see her back in London. Mrs. Coulter, as usual, is not willing to accept defeat, and when she tries to push back against this, Father MacPhail delights in telling her that Yofer, who has been keeping Lord Asriel prisoner, is dead, and that Yurik Bernison is now in charge of Svalbard. Basically, every card that Mrs. Coulter had in this game has turned out to be a dud. Mrs. Coulter is not one to be beaten easily though, and she finds out that the Magisterium is heading north to go have a standoff with Lord Asriel and kill him before anything dramatic happens, since they know that he has very big plans. Mrs. Coulter sees this as her way in, and she gets very close to Father MacPhail. She's definitely trying to use her physical charm against him. She really gets in his grill, and she says, "I know Asriel, you know that I know him." And she also says that she knows how his mind thinks. She has studied dust much more than Father MacPhail has, for example, and any experiments that he's successfully done, she'll be able to interpret for the Magisterium. She says, "Please don't deny the Magisterium my help." I love the spin that Mrs. Coulter always has. She is a very savvy lady, and she knows how to get what she wants. We see Father MacPhail bend to her will, and as she gets closer to him, he goes so far as to lean into her face, and it looks like she has some blood on her chin. But he does that, and he says, "Okay, you can come, but remember what we're doing here. Lord Asriel has to die." This is a success for Mrs. Coulter, and she seems pretty satisfied with that answer as she surveys all of the preparations around her. She is heading north, and we're going to have a great confrontation. Will and Elaine Perry get back to their house and realize that someone has definitely been there. There's stuff all over the floor, and it's clear that someone has been going through all of their belongings to look for documents, and specifically those letters. Will has the sense to say, "We need to get out of here because someone might still be here." He gets Elaine out, and he takes her to the person he knows he can trust, his boxing instructor from one of the previous episodes. He tells his teacher that their house has been broken into and that his mom is quite upset and she needs somewhere to stay while he cleans up the house. Will's teacher is really picking up on the fact that there are many things that Will isn't saying, and he knows that this is really a time of need for the Perrys, so he tells Will that of course Elaine can stay, and when Will says that he might need her to stay overnight, his teacher says, "Good thing I have an extra pair of pajamas, why don't you come in?" As soon as that agreement is made, he hugs Elaine, and Elaine says, "Go find those letters." She knows what Will is up to, and she's definitely giving him her blessing here. For the first time in this episode, we are taken to Lee Scoresby and his busted balloon. We see Lee and Hester trying to fix the balloon. Luckily, this doesn't last very long because Serafina lands next to him, and she says, "Can I give you a lift?" essentially. Serafina tells Lee that Lyra, Yurik, and Roger are all safe and are all thriving. She also tells him that his role in all of this is not over by a long shot, and she will definitely need him to continue doing what he's doing. Back in our world, Will returns to his house and goes directly to the letters under his mom's sewing machine. He finds them, but he hears that someone is definitely also there, and after shoving the letters into his backpack, we see him, I believe, wrap a belt around his fist. He is ready to fight whoever he finds intruding, and sure enough, he sees Thomas, and Thomas trips over Will's cat. Thomas goes flying over the banister on the second floor of the house, and he crashes on the first floor with an ominous thud. Will panics, knows that he cannot stick around, and he leaves the house immediately. The dark-haired private investigator that Boreal has hired sees Thomas dead on the floor, and we're kind of left that way. We see Elaine looking out of Will's instructor's house into the darkness, and after she turns around to leave, Will actually walks by the house, and he decides not to go in. He is not coming to pick up his mom. There is something else going on, and he has other plans. After a long journey traveling with Yurik across Svalbard, Roger, Lyra, and Yurik finally arrive at Lord Asriel's lab. We have an incredible scene of this mountaintop and seeing just how remote the lab is under the Aurora Borealis. And as the kids get off Yurik's back and he tells them that he's here for them if they need him, Roger takes Lyra aside and says, "I know that you're brave, but if you do happen to be scared, please know that I'm here for you." And they share a really warm hug. And Lyra says, "Is this for me or is this for you?" Roger says, "A bit of both." And it's a really sweet, genuine moment of friendship when we can really appreciate just how far these two have come. As soon as Lyra knocks on the door and Thorold answers, Thorold being Asriel's manservant, they walk into Asriel's lab. Lyra finally sees Lord Asriel, her father, at the top of the stairs, and he seems less than excited to see her. She tells him that she's come all of this way to bring him the alethiometer, and his response is to freak out completely. He comes down the stairs screaming and saying, "No, no, no, I did not send for you, I did not send for you." He seems weird and desperate and wild and very emotional. Adriel is really freaking out about this, and his demon, Stelmaria, says, "Hey buddy, look, there's another kid." And when Adriel sees Roger, his expression changes completely and he realizes that there is a second child here. Lyra has brought a friend. He asks Roger who he is, and after Roger tells him that he works in the kitchens at Jordan and his name is Roger Parslow, Lord Adriel seems like a very different man. His panic and desperation is gone, and he seems delighted to meet Roger. I'm sure this is meant to creep us out. We have no idea what's going on if we haven't read the books, and all we know is that something is not quite right with Adriel, and he doesn't seem to care about the alethiometer at all. I don't think my parting thoughts are going to shock anyone. This episode was a disappointment to me, and in some ways a travesty. The original material of his Dark Materials is so groundbreaking and so controversial because it is in many ways so inappropriate for the audience that it has been marketed to. I really wanted to see some of the grittiness of the bear fight, and I felt like it was neutered in a way that really echoed what the 2007 adaptation did for The Golden Compass. I would also love to see an explanation or read about why the production team decided to take the armor off of the bears. That's not as big of a deal to me, but I am curious about it. In any case, I am optimistic about the next episode. I'm curious to see what we're going to see in terms of Will's storyline, and I'm excited to see Mrs. Coulter and Lord Asriel finally meet. Thank you guys so much for watching as usual, and I want to wish everyone a happy holiday, whether you're celebrating the winter solstice or Hanukkah or Christmas. All of those things are happening very, very soon. So I hope you enjoy whichever holiday you celebrate and however way you choose to celebrate it. Have a great week.